Begin the afternoon session. We're ready to begin the afternoon session. My role here is actually just to introduce Jack Shonkoff and then get off the stage. I'm pleased and honored to be able to introduce Jack. Jack is a professor of child health and development at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital, and he's director of Harvard's Center on the Developing Child. He's also the chair of the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, which is a multi-university collaboration comprising leading scholars in neuroscience, psychology, pediatrics, and economics, whose mission is to bring credible science to bear on public policy affecting young children. Many of you may recall the National Academy of Sciences report From Neurons to Neighborhoods, the Science of Early Childhood Development. Jack was the chair of the board on children, youth, and families and chaired the committee that produced that report. There is, as you can see, both in the materials and if you go to the website for the Harvard Center, you can see a much longer bio, but I'll stop on the formal part just so that Jack can actually get to talk. I do want to say that we invited Jack to be here at the WREC because many of us believe that the work that he and the Harvard Center on the Developing Child are doing has potentially far-reaching implications for how we think about child development and the needs of young children and the roles of parents and caregivers in promoting the healthy development of their children. And as you'll hear, the work has some potential direct implications for employment and training programs and for state and local TANF efforts. I don't want to get ahead of the presentation itself in my introduction, but I do want to say that I've known Jack since his Neurons to Neighborhood days. I feel like I learn new things and I think new thoughts every time that I hear him speak. I'm tremendously pleased that he's with us today, and I'll turn things over to Jack.
Well, thank you, Mark, for that really generous introduction, and to you and Naomi Goldstein, excuse me, and others. It's actually a real honor and a treat for me to be here. So I just want to say before we start that I feel as if the world that I have been working in and the world that you work in has been the same world for a long time, and it's really exciting to think about how we might be coming together around a common knowledge base and think about where our fields might be going next. So you can see from the title of this presentation, I want to emphasize the operative words here are the fact that we have a very strong science that could inform what we're doing in both the world of adult workforce development and other programs focused on adults living in poverty and on helping children get out of poverty and hopefully not be the next generation of adults who are raising children in poverty. So that's the foundations issue, and also with a strong emphasis on innovation. And that's going to be a kind of a major theme of my comments this afternoon, is that up until a couple of years ago, I think many of us were viewing this rapidly developing science as a great way to build public support and political will for investing in, particularly in children living in low-income environments. But now I think we're beginning to appreciate the fact that there are opportunities for driving innovation. So let me just start by saying that I'm not an early childhood imperialist here. So I'm not saying that everything that happens in early childhood is the most important part of the life cycle, because it's just one part of the life cycle. But there certainly is a very strong knowledge base that's making the case that the foundations of pretty much all the things we care about get laid down in the early childhood period. So what happens, and actually the early childhood period keeps moving back. So it used to be from birth, it's moving in both directions. So it used to be everybody talked about birth to 3, then they talked about birth to 5. Now people are talking about birth to 8. Kind of watch out, 9-year-olds, right, here it comes. But also what the science is telling us is that birth is not exactly starting at the beginning. And in fact, the prenatal period is actually not exactly starting at the beginning. The health of a woman before she becomes pregnant is the beginning of the determination of whether a pregnancy is going to be high risk or not. So there really is a cycle dimension here. But pretty much everything that a sustainable society needs, whether it be a population that's well educated, that's economically productive, that is engaged in responsible citizenship and constructive membership in communities, healthy, both physical and mental health, the ability to parent the next generation, all of this has its roots in early childhood. And I'm going to share with you this afternoon a fair amount of the science that makes this case. And I really want to be clear about this. Nothing that I'm presenting is my own personal opinion. Okay? I'm actually standing on the shoulders of the scientific community here, and we subject our public comments to an incredibly rigorous peer review test. So I'm actually going to present a fairly conservative perspective on the science, no kind of imaginary flights of fancy to kind of drive a partisan agenda. This is kind of real where the hardcore science is. So that we are living through right now a revolution in biology. And a lot of this kind of periodically creeps into the press, but the advances that have been made really literally just in the last 10 years, last 15 years in neuroscience and molecular biology, genomics. I think most people understand this is transforming the way we treat disease. And the way we will be treating disease in hospitals 10 years from now is going to be so different from the way it's been in the past. But these advances, along with continuing progress in the behavioral and social sciences, is actually sitting here waiting to be used by those of us who are focused on more macro issues and influences on health and development. So this is not just for the treatment of exotic disease in a hospital. And this is not just for people who see tremendous possibilities of lucrative investments in biotechnology that will produce amazing breakthroughs in treatment for disease that will cost a lot of money. But this same science is sitting here waiting to be used to think in different ways about what could we do to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty? What could we do to improve outcomes in physical and mental health, as well as learning and the ability to be economically productive? Because in the final analysis, it's not kind of magic that adversity kind of leads to problems in economic productivity and mental health and physical health. There's a process by which that level of adversity actually gets into the body and affects the brain and affects other organ systems. It's not an accident that poor people get more heart disease, get more cancer, don't live as long. And what's exciting about this new science is it's beginning to open the black box and explain how does that happen. I mean, this is not just a matter of access to health care and good education, because other countries that provide pretty much the same health care and education for everybody also have this phenomenon of poor people get sick more and don't do as well in school. So what I'm going to do for a start is show you two brief videos. This first one, each one runs about a minute and a quarter. This is your crash course in neurobiology. Okay, after you watch this animation for about a minute and 15, 20, 30 seconds, whatever, you will be introduced to all of the basic principles that we understand right now at the frontier of neurobiology about how early experiences literally shape the architecture of the developing brain. So let's go.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
Okay, so let me just highlight a few of the important principles that are illustrated in this animation. First, brains are built over time. That process begins during pregnancy. At birth, a newborn has most of the, not all, but most of the brain cells he or she will have for an entire life, but very few of the connections among the cells. And it's those connections, those circuits that, literally determine everything from how we're able to understand language, to solve problems, to communicate, to engage socially, to kind of write novels, to work in factories, and on and on and on. All of that has to do with how the brain develops skills over time. And what happens early lays the foundation, and then subsequent circuitry, as you mature, builds on that foundation. If the foundation is strong, you're building on a sturdy base. If the foundation is weak, and I'll talk in a few minutes about what weakens the foundation, then you're playing catch-up later. And this is obviously a huge issue for people who work in a variety of fields that focus on adults who've grown up in poverty, who've had limited education, who have had very difficult life experiences, such that it is likely that the early circuitry has been in some way affected by adversity, which you'll hear about in a minute. But that's not to say that this is a kind of a overly determined process that you can't undo later. It doesn't mean the brain is always capable of being adaptive in different ways, but it's harder as you get older, and I'll say more about that a little bit later. So this is the basic principles of brain development. It's built over time. It's highly influenced by experience. And this old nature versus nurture argument, how much of this is genetic and hardwired and how much is affected by experience? So do you remember the Human Genome Project? Kind of ancient history, like 10 years ago, maybe, when the genetic code was cracked and the sequencing was figured out. So what the scientists who worked on the Human Genome Project will now tell you, and trust me, most of them have no political agenda. They're not really interested in engaging with an audience like this. They're really just focused on the science. They will tell you that hardly anything that we talk about here that matters is genetically hardwired. It's all heavily influenced by experience, heavily influenced by experience. Now, that's the end of your crash course in normative brain development. Now let's talk about what happens under conditions of adversity. Okay? So the first issue here, this is actually interesting. This is a different presentation than the one I thought. I'm just going to roll with it. I thought I took this slide out. Okay, let's hope that the rest of this is what I thought. So this is the issue about barriers to educational achievement that appear at an early age. So many of you are dealing with the problems of adults, adolescents and adults who haven't completed high school, who have limited literacy and math skills, and we're trying to figure out how to get their lives back on track. Well, the issue about what to do about building a stronger foundation, let's say, for literacy and academic achievement, is to show that there are 3 curves representing the growth in vocabulary between the birth and 3 years of age, actually 4. And the red line are children who grow up in college-educated families with 2 parents. The blue line in the middle are children who grow up in families where both parents have no more than a high school education. And the green line are children growing up largely in single-parent families where there's no high school graduation. And you see that differences in the size of a child's vocabulary begin to appear around 18 months of age, and in the absence of intervention get bigger as time goes on. So all this talk about let's get started early, and let's, certainly the President's initiative on preschool is a huge step in the right direction. But actually, preschool at age 4 is already 2 years too late to kind of intervene early because those gaps are beginning to appear even before a child is 1.5 years of age. Now, these data from the next slide are taken from a study done of children in the child welfare system, representing a sample from all the states. So all of the children in this study were active cases in Child Protective Services. And the question was, what about the additional pileup of other risk factors, aside from maltreatment, which all the children experienced? So if you started to look at other risk factors like limited parent education, limited income, family violence, substance abuse, maternal depression, other factors, all of which are associated with a higher risk for lots of problems later in life, we find is that as the number of risk factors increases, the percentage of children who at age 3 fail a developmental test gets to the point where by the time you're at 6 or 7 risk factors, essentially 90 to 100% of these children at age 3 are already far enough behind in a developmental test that they would be eligible for special education. And this is all preventable. Remember, this is not about any hard wiring that was present at birth. This is the effect of a pileup of adversity that influences the development of the brain. And I'll say a little bit more detailed about that in a second. These data are taken from a study done in Dunedin, New Zealand, a small city all the way on the other side of the world. They come from a study, a longitudinal birth cohort study, where in a particular year, every pregnant woman in this town was enrolled in a study during the pregnancy and agreed to be followed during the pregnancy, and then after the child was born, that child is followed for as long as people are willing to pay for that follow-up study. Well, these data I'm going to show you now are from the 30-year follow-up study. I think it's 32 years. So these are data collected from pregnancy now up to 32 years of age. And in this case, what was looked at was measuring a substance in the blood called C-reactive protein. This is a chemical that reflects an overactive inflammatory system. It's been associated with a higher risk for heart disease, so you could think of this as something like an elevated cholesterol level. An elevated C-reactive protein level indicates some greater risk for getting a heart attack at some point. It doesn't mean you have heart disease, it means you're at greater risk. So what did they find at age 32? They found that in the normal population of healthy 32-year-olds, about 15% had elevated C-reactive proteins. Represents a normal variant. It's probably somewhat genetically influenced, kind of maybe a mild additional risk may be associated with family history for heart disease. Those who had a diagnosis of depression at age 32, a clinical diagnosis of depression, had higher elevated levels of C-reactive protein, and that's consistent with many other studies that have shown that depression is associated with a higher inflammatory response in the body. So this was just confirming things that we already knew. The next finding was not confirming anything, it was a new finding. Individuals who had a history of having been maltreated as children, documented at the time, had even higher levels of C-reactive protein, approaching 30%, actually a little bit above 30%. And 32-year-olds who were maltreated as children and had depression at age 32 were close to 40% of them had elevated C-reactive proteins. Now, I'm going to be a very conservative scientist and tell you, what does this single study mean? A single study doesn't mean anything by itself. This is not a smoking gun. But this is part of a larger and growing literature that is growing yearly, with more and more studies now showing an association between a pileup of adversity, and particularly maltreatment, and, if you will, a biological memory, so that this was not people remembering they were maltreated. This was recorded at the time when they were younger. And whether, as adults, people remembered the maltreatment or not, the body remembers. There are biological memories that linger. Now, we might look at this and say, oh my goodness, so is there nothing we can do about that? No. In the same way that an elevated cholesterol level doesn't mean that you can't do things to improve your health outcomes. But what it does mean is that significant adversity early in life, whether it's remembered or not, and this is particularly an issue for very young children, because none of us remember anything before, age 4? Maybe some of you very clairvoyant people remember something when you were 3. But if something bad happened to you when you were 2 or 1, or something wonderful happened, you wouldn't remember that. But your body remembers if there was significant adversity. So what I want to do now is go to the next slide, and this is the second animation, to give you a little bit of a crash course in the biology of adversity, addressing this issue of toxic stress that can actually have a significant disruptive impact on the development of the brain and other organs.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So let me just say a few words about this concept of stress before I go on. So if anybody is going to leave before I'm finished, let me catch you before you go out the door and say there is no part of this message that says that we need to protect people from stress. Okay? Stress is a normal part of life. It is inevitable. Learning how to deal with stress is an important part of healthy, normal development. And plus, in our political culture, in this country, stress is a loser as a kind of a call to action because there's no sympathy for stress in this culture. It's this culture from the first time the Mayflower put its anchor down in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is a country that has believed in the importance of overcoming adversity, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Stress will make you stronger. So let me kind of clarify what we mean by toxic stress, okay? Because there's a part of stress that we would call positive stress, which is the ability to deal with manageable adversity. Tolerable stress for a young child is the first day in a child care center where you don't know anybody. Or being told you have to share your toy, so you can't have 5 cookies right now. That kind of gets your heart pumping and it gets your stress hormone levels up. And what happens is in the presence of adults who teach you how to deal with stress, over time you develop your own capacity to cope and adapt with things that are threatening or stressful. And from a biological point of view, you're helping to bring your stress system back to baseline. So there's nothing about stress that a child who's never experienced stress is in big trouble. And what I'm talking about, because you don't learn how to deal with it. And when I talk about stress, I'm not talking about the cause of the stress, I'm talking about the physiological response. So everybody here knows what that feels like. This is a room of successful, accomplished adults. So everybody here knows what it feels like to be physiologically stressed. Some of you may experience headache or a knot in your stomach or an ache in your back or you sweat. Whatever it is, you're experiencing your heart rate increasing, your blood pressure increasing, your stress hormone levels going up, your insulin levels going up, your blood sugar going up. That's good. Your stress response system is your friend. This is the part of the fight or flight response. It's a good thing to have when you're threatened. So once we get past the positive stress issue, there's what we call tolerable stress, which is more than just you have to go into a nap. Tolerable stress could be like the death or serious illness in the family, or it could be being the survivor of a natural disaster or an act of terrorism, or something where everybody worries about the potential consequences of post-traumatic stress symptoms or disorder. And what do we do naturally before? Remember, the species has survived before we learned all of this in science. So by natural instincts, in moments of stress, adults huddle around children and give them a sense of safety and protection if the adults have that capacity. And that is not only helping the children to develop their own mechanisms for coping, but it's bringing their stress system back to baseline before it can do the damage that potentially could be done by toxic stress, which is this chronic, excessive activation of the stress system in the absence of any stable adult presence to kind of help you feel safe and help you cope. Okay, so that's kind of the background, and this is the end of the basic science part of my presentation. Okay, so to put the two, and then I want to go on to talk about how we could use this for thinking about policies and practices that could be more effective than what we're doing right now. But the main principles here are that that early experiences literally get into our bodies. They're built into our bodies for better or for worse. And also for those of you who are parents or grandparents or have friends or neighbors who have kids, which is just about everybody here, please do not go home and worry about whether the kids you know are experiencing toxic stress because they're not being attended to every single minute of the day. You know, some kids are driven crazy by well-meaning, highly educated, wealthy people who want to make sure that everybody has every optimal moment for learning. We're not that fragile. We would not have survived as a species. But what it does say is that after a certain point, an overload, a cumulative burden of adversity can have literally a wear and tear effect on the body. And it increases insulin resistance, so it makes you likely to get diabetes. It accelerates atherosclerosis. And it has a wear and tear effect that actually can shorten your lifespan. This is real. And whether people want to believe in the science or not, or want to act on the science, it's real. It's there. And by the way, I've had some wonderful experiences in some states where the people I've spoken with actually don't believe in evolutionary biology and believe in intelligent design. You can believe in intelligent design and think that this is God's wisdom to have experience shape the brain the way it develops. So we don't even have to disagree and argue about where it comes from. We can agree that the evidence is overwhelming that experience gets into the body. So what I want to do now is shift to how we might use this to think about the policies and programs that we have in place across generations. So my perspective is early childhood. Most of you are working at the adult end of this. This is what we have in common. The adults you're working with were once little children, many of them experiencing significant adversity growing up in poverty themselves. The children who are the focus in many of the programs I work with are going to be adults someday, and they're going to go from being the children that everybody cares about and feels sorry for to the adults who everybody's angry with and doesn't want to help. But it's the same. This is this intergenerational cycle that needs to be reduced. And science is sitting here saying, I have some ideas. Would you like to hear them? So I'll share that. So let me start. Okay, so this is different. That's okay, I'll wing it. I'm not sure which slides will come next, but it's a reasonable variation on what I hope. I hope some of my best ones weren't cut out at the end. Well, okay, we'll see. So let me first start with what the general conceptual framework is for our policies and programs right now for children living in poverty. They're based on this notion that some combination of providing rich learning experiences for children in center-based programs, parenting education for their parents, usually mothers, good access to good health care, adequate nutrition, and a health-promoting environment that is minimizing unintentional injuries and exposure to toxins. That combination will lead to a healthy developmental trajectory that will produce readiness to appear at school, at kindergarten or first grade, ready to succeed. Okay? It's basically an enrichment model based on providing enrichment for children and information for their families. And in most cases, that works. First of all, many families don't need anything other than what they and their neighbors provide. Many children living in poverty are living in families that do a magnificent job in the face of a lot of adversity in raising their children. And then as we get to a more and more disadvantaged part of the population, there's a need for some outside help. In some cases, it's provided by neighbors and friends. In other cases, it could actually be provided by a publicly supported program. Okay? But from the brain's point of view, are there adults who are providing the kind of environment that will buffer children from stress and promote the kind of experiences that lead to healthy development. The problem, so for most children this works, but there's a part of the population where despite whatever we do, children still end up coming to school with serious problems, not being prepared to succeed, either behaviorally or academically, and we still have persistent illness that differs by social class. So we started to use the science that I just shared with you to say, how could we start to think differently about this, remembering that this is, again, another thing we have in common. So the roots of your programs and the roots of the programs that I'm more familiar with go back to, many of them go back to the War on Poverty and the Great Society programs of the 1960s. That is almost a half a century ago, okay? Almost half a century. And a lot of the principles that influence the development of these programs and some of the scientific concepts are still sound today. 50 years later, they're still sound. But we have all this new knowledge, and the question is, how are we using this? What could we do differently? Okay. So we started to think about this science and actually began to be struck by the fact that there are two kind of principles that come out of the new science that are enough to say it's a game changer for early childhood policy in this country, which is basically an education policy for school readiness. So the first game changer is that early experiences affect lifelong health as much as they affect learning. This is not just about preparation to succeed in school. This is not just early literacy. This is getting at the early foundations of heart disease and hypertension and diabetes and cancer and depression and substance abuse problems and anxiety disorders and a whole host of very expensive and very debilitating threats to health. So for starters, this needs to be a much more broadly accepted responsibility and not laying everything on the poor Department of Education and the education budget. It's as much about health as it is about learning. The second, and this is going to be my major theme for the rest of my remarks that relate very much to the issues that you folks are dealing with every day, is that the science is telling us that healthy development requires more than just enrichment and giving people information. That for children living in very adverse conditions, healthy development requires not just enrichment, but buffering protection against the consequences of toxic stress. And if we provide enriched learning experiences and we talk to children more and we read to them more and we provide wonderful learning experiences and programs and we give information to parents about things that promote healthy development, we don't do something about reducing the burden of adversity that is contributing to toxic stress, we're kind of swimming upstream. So with these two principles in mind, and let me also reinforce for you that what I'm talking about on this slide and the rest of my presentation is kind of hypothesis and best thinking, new theories of change. If anyone would ask a reasonable question of where are the data to support what I just said, so the data for this don't come from a program study, they come from a whole world of research in biology and neuroscience and molecular biology and genomics. That's pretty powerful evidence. It's different from a randomized controlled trial of an intervention. We need to expand our concept of what we mean by relevant evidence, not just information from program evaluations. So with these two potential paradigm shifts in our mind, we then started to think about how we might generate specific hypotheses that could be tested to guide new intervention strategies. So let me just make an editorial comment here. I feel very comfortable getting up in front of an audience of people who focus on children and work particularly in the early childhood world and say, we need to do better. We need new ideas. It would be inappropriate and wrong for me to come to an audience of people who are working in a field that is not the field that I have had my roots in, although you could see how totally relevant your world is to the early childhood world. But I am not going to get up here and say, you could do better. That's for you to decide. But I will say, from the perspective of looking at things from the child's point of view, we have to do better because we're not making enough of a dent. Let me make it really clear. A lot of the things that we do in early childhood have a significant impact on children. We have demonstrated over and over again that we can improve outcomes. This is no longer an important question to study. We know that we can improve outcomes. But the question is, are we improving them enough? What about the most disadvantaged children? How could we do better? And to say that we need to do better, from my perspective, is a sign of a field that is strong, not a field that is weak. Because in the biomedical world, which is where my roots are, I'm a pediatrician by training, over the course of my career, I've seen a lot of diseases that used to be fatal that aren't fatal anymore. I've seen a lot of diseases where children who have them now do much better than they used to. And nobody's ever said that we're not making progress in healthcare, but there are a lot of health problems that children have, and we legitimately will say we need to do a lot better. We're not going to stop until we get much better outcomes, whether it be something that's easy to measure, like life or death, or something that's hard to measure, like the quality of life living with a chronic health impairment. Okay? And in the corporate world, which I think we have a lot to learn from, I wish I had thought about that earlier in my career, the people who are at the top of their field know that no matter how good they are and how much they dominate their field, they better be the next person to come up with the next idea first, or they're no longer going to dominate their field. So we need to embrace that in the world of policies and programs focused on poverty, to say, of course we have things that make a difference. We see that every day, but also we need to be better. We need bigger impacts. And my message here is the science is sitting here saying, let me tell you what I know, see if you can use it. So here's how we've used it. We have 3 hypotheses that are driving some work that we're doing right now to try new things. And the first 2, even though they started with an early childhood frame, are right smack in the middle of the world that you're all working in. So the first thing that we said as we got a group together was, so if we need to shift the way we think about early childhood services, and we need a new framework that provides not just enrichment, but a combination of protection and enrichment, that's going to require more than giving information to parents. We're going to have to start to build their capacity and their skills to buffer their children against adversity. I mean, it's one thing to say to somebody, it's really important to talk to your child, to talk to your baby, even though your baby can't talk yet, because the brain is taking that in. It's really important to read to your child before we would expect a child to read, because exposure to books and literacy is going to affect how the circuits develop in the brain. It's another thing to kind of basically ask people to do that whose own lives have been heavily burdened by adversity, who may not have the capacity to do this on a regular basis. No less, buffer children from the stresses of deep poverty, violence, mental illness, substance abuse. You can finish that paragraph. So as we started to talk about what kinds of skills do we need to build for more effective parenting, someone in the room said, these sound to me like the same kind of skills you need to get a job. And I'm going to talk about those skills in a second. And we started to realize, that's right. Because a lot of the skills, you want to talk about the ultimate multitasking challenge is taking care of a little child. No less 2 children, how about 3? And if you can manage that in a reasonable way to promote a well-regulated environment, you're well prepared for a whole host of ways of functioning in the employment system. And when that was mentioned, someone in the room said, well, yeah, that sounds nice, but what are you going to do about that? And this person said, and this is a true story. This was 2.5 years ago. So if we're going to start to develop parenting programs that are building capacities in adults for parenting, with the kind of skills we're talking about, which I'll explain to you in a second, we should make those programs eligible for the work requirement for TANF, because it sounds like they're also building good foundational skills for work. And so someone else in the room said, oh, yeah, great idea. How are you going to make that happen? And the person said, well, I'm the commissioner, and I'm going to make that happen this week, because I can do that just by changing the regulations. And boy, that was a real eye-opener for me about what could happen by putting that knowledge in the hands of people who could actually act on it. This didn't require an act of Congress or an act of the state legislature. This was a state-level discussion. So as we move from our first hypothesis, which began exclusively on parenting, we quickly moved to a second hypothesis, was that improving parenting skills and the kind of skills that we felt were prerequisites for providing a well-regulated home environment for healthy development, that we would simultaneously, for the same nickel, not a separate program, be enhancing the employability of these parents, and as a result of that, increasing the likelihood of greater economic stability and security of the family, which would be another plus in terms of reducing adversity, cutting back on the burden of risk factors, and moving toward greater outcomes for the children. Remember, our focus has always been the children, but our children are kind of your future clients if we don't do something different when they're young. And I think the interesting message for this audience is, here I am, an early childhood person who's come to this brilliant conclusion that it's all about the adults. Okay? And if we want to really, I was using brilliant as a joke, okay? But that if we want to make a significant breakthrough impacts for children, we have to start focusing more on the adults who take care of them, and not just thinking that somehow we'll have these magic things happen by creating center-based programs. Because in addition to that, many of the people who work in center-based programs, particularly childcare in this country, are low-income women with limited education, who are not much different from any of the parents who we see as needing extra help. So this is not just building skills of parents, this is building skills for people who work in childcare programs. And what do? We provide mostly didactic information, and we have people sit in rooms and make lectures to them, which may not be the most effective. The third is this issue of neighborhood effects on development. Okay? So we all know, going back to the Great Society programs, that families live in communities, and communities exist in a political and in a cultural context, in an economic context. And so there's a very rich tradition of noting and valuing the importance of building community capacity, building community strengths, building a sense of collective efficacy and empowerment, and dealing with sources of institutionalized exclusion and discrimination. Okay? But from the science point of view, our question always is, how does that happen? How does what happens at a neighborhood level get into the body and affect health and affect learning? And again, there's a very persuasive hypothesis to be said that rather than, if we're going to be focusing at the community level, we should be asking, what are the major precipitants of toxic stress in this community, and how can we reduce those? Because if you go back to that earlier study about the pile-up of risk, every risk factor that we can diminish increases the likelihood that more children will do better. And that's why dealing with community violence and substance abuse is important, not just because it seems like it would be nicer to live in a community with less violence and substance abuse, but because the adversity and pressure from that context is getting built in through the pressures that everybody is feeling into the bodies of children as they're developing. So let me talk a little bit about these skills, these kind of magical skills that I'm talking about. So again, I think in the world that you work in, many of these are called life skills or social skills. And I hate this term soft skills because there's nothing soft about them. And in my world, they're called parenting skills. And in the world of cognitive neuroscience and developmental psychology, a lot of these are what are called executive function and self-regulation skills. We've studied these for decades. Now we actually know where they are in the brain. Different parts of the brain light up when you test different things. What are these skills? These are the kind of foundational skills of being a competent adult, and by the way, starting with being a competent student in school. This is the ability to focus and sustain your attention on something, to set goals, to make plans, to follow rules, solve problems, monitor actions, defer gratification, control your impulses. Okay? And this is when science and common sense come together, you really have something going. So this is kind of what your grandmother could have told you. What do you need to succeed in school? You need to sit still, pay attention, follow directions, understand instructions, keep your hands to yourself. What do you need to kind of be successful in the workplace? You need to work together with people. You have to solve problems when they come up. You have to control your impulses. I'll ask any of you in the place you work, I'll say this for my place. When things aren't going well, I do not wish that everybody in the office had 5 more IQ points. I wish everybody in the office knew how to work together and knew how to kind of solve a problem together and deal with adversity when it comes, because it always comes. So the interesting thing about this is these skills develop in a part of the brain, one of the 3 parts of the brain, that's most vulnerable to toxic stress. When stress hormone levels are increased, they particularly disrupt circuits in the prefrontal cortex, where a lot of these skills develop. So think about what this science can make you, when you look at a 6-year-old who is getting off to a bad start in school, or a 26-year-old who's having a hard time focusing on settling down in a job. What this ought to tee us up to think about is, don't just assume it's a bad attitude or lack of motivation, but consider the possibility that there has been some effect on the development of the circuitry in that part of the brain that influences the ability to pay attention, to follow directions, to follow through on a series of steps that you ask people to do. It's not simply that people don't care. There may be a problem in the way these skills have developed, but that is not a death sentence. It doesn't mean you can't do anything about it, and that's why this is so important. So let me finish with a few ways to go back to the science now and think about how we might approach this. So this is the challenge. This is the sad fact for all of us about neurobiology and the development of the brain. What I'm going to click on now is the curve that shows you how the plasticity of the brain, the ability of the brain to adapt, to adjust, to be flexible, this is what it looks like over the lifespan. It's a sad thing to look at, right? Brain plasticity is optimal in early childhood. It drops dramatically in early childhood and into middle childhood. And then it doesn't drop as dramatically, but it keeps petering off, okay? So, and why is that? Well, actually, many of you could answer that. Go back to the first animation, because at birth and in early infancy, the brain has all of its cells but very few of its circuits. It's optimally plastic. At birth, the brain has the capacity to speak any language in the world. By 9 to 12 months of age, already the brain is losing the ability to tell the difference in sounds of languages it's never heard. And the world's greatest genius at age 30 who could never learn a new language without speaking an accent. That's an example of decreasing plasticity. The brain specializes, it gets rid of what it doesn't use, it strengthens what it needs, so it gets less adaptable. And the cost to the brain of adapting and making adjustments goes up as plasticity goes down. It literally, the brain has to use more oxygen and more glucose to make new circuits to adapt to new challenges that it hasn't been set up to deal with. But recognize one thing, even this slide goes up to age 70, screen's only so wide. If it went up to 110, if there was someone in this room who's 100 years old, who was listening to this lecture, who left here learning something that he or she didn't know before, and if that person remembered it tomorrow, a new circuit was made in the brain. That's the time that the brain loses its ability to make any adaptations or learn anything new is when you have a flat line and they pull the sheet up and say, you know, he's a great guy, we're going to miss him, right? But up until that point, the brain always has the capacity to learn new things, and certainly when we're dealing with adolescents and young adults, there is no basis, no scientific basis for writing people off at all, but it's harder. The later you start, the harder it is because of basic principles of brain development. And it not only costs more physiologically to the brain, it costs more in dollars to kind of fix things later. And this is where, ask your grandmother for some good examples. A very aggressive, hard-to-control 2-year-old can be a handful. But that's nothing compared to a very aggressive, hard-to-control 12-year-old, who I will take any day over an aggressive, hard-to-control 22-year-old. Okay, that's brain plasticity. It's not just size. It's not just weight, it's brain plasticity, the inability or the difficulty in trying to undo patterns that have been established. So the clock is always ticking, but it's never too late. Early is always better than later. Prevention is better than trying to fix things later, but it is never too late to make a difference. But why do we keep making it so hard and so expensive when we keep waiting for the casualties down the road? And also recognizing, particularly for TANF, where by definition, everyone in TANF who's eligible has a young child, right? And so there it is. The cycle is ready to reproduce, and there we go. So, so Mother Nature is basically giving us a special break here. Here's what the period, the plasticity curve looks like, and the period of development of the circuitry in the prefrontal cortex, which is where executive function skills are located. It looks something like this. So a couple of features here. One is it doesn't really plateau and reach its maximum until about age 25 to 30 years. So for the first 25 to 30 years, these skills are still developing. The period of most rapid development is from age 3 to 5. It begins at birth. This is now just the last couple of years. We have more and more studies with neuroimaging to show that you can see social class differences in the ability to focus attention and to notice differences beginning in infancy. And you can see neuroimaging differences in the brain beginning in infancy based on the environments kids are living in. But the biggest jump is age 3 to 5. And again, your grandmother could have told you that, because the difference between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old is a 5-year-old can sit longer, pay attention longer, control impulses, and play and understand Simon Says in a way that a 3-year-old can't, because a 3-year-old can't remember the shift in rules. Okay? But so here's Mother Nature saying, you know, you guys are awfully stubborn, so I'm going to give you one more chance. There's another period from late adolescence to early adulthood where there's another accelerated time of development of the higher level executive function skills. Optimal plasticity influenced by experience. So here it is. Think about it. People from age 15 to 25 primed for executive function skill development. And what are we doing in our end of the world, in the early childhood world? We're giving people advice and information. When we have skills that we know actually get better with coaching and practice and modeling. Okay? That's kind of how these skills develop. They don't develop on automatic pilot. Young children learn them by having adults around them who have those skills, who help the children develop them themselves. And adults who haven't had a chance to develop them can develop them by mentoring or coaching that actually focuses on building these skills. And what's beautiful about the coaching, and we didn't make this up, that's what the data show, is that there's nothing stigmatizing about coaching and practice. Elite athletes have coaches, and they practice. And corporate CEOs have executive coaches. So there's nothing demeaning about having a coach to strengthen your skills. And that's what we should be doing instead of, at least from my end, giving people information about child development or maybe teaching them how to fill out a job application. So, oh God, this is a different, I don't know how that happened. I'm not going to go through this slide. Oh, I had two great slides at the end. They're not going to be here. Okay, well, too bad. I'll tell you about them. So I'm going to end with, okay, so here are three take-home messages to kind of recapitulate everything I just said. I'll just speak for the early childhood world, and you folks can speak for the adult anti-poverty world. From my perspective, it's time for a whole new era in early childhood policy and practice, one that goes beyond giving people information and support and providing stimulation programs for kids and focusing on building adult capacities to provide the kind of environments that will promote healthy development. When we first started to think about this 2 years ago, quite honestly, I was very nervous about saying this publicly because I didn't want people to think that this was in any way demeaning the value of what we're doing right now, because we know that what we're doing right now makes a difference. But the message is it may take a bigger difference. But here's what we found. It's like we touched a nerve. Practitioners and people who work in community programs are hungry for new ideas. They know where they're making a difference. They know where the intervention effects are less than what they would like. And all of us know, it was mentioned in the early morning panel, there were several comments in the TANF panel about the fact that we all know how to game this system. Poor people know how to game this system. Rich people know how to game this system. Everybody knows how to give information to funders or people who are watching over you to tell them what they want to hear. Okay? But all of us know in the poverty world that we're making a big difference for some families. We're making not as much of a difference as we'd like for others. And for some of the most disadvantaged, we're hardly making a dent. And we should feel strong enough now and confident enough in the knowledge that we have and the science behind what we do to say we need new ideas. We need to do better. Second, policymakers and civic leaders, they are looking for fresh thinking. They want to increase the returns on their investment in education and healthcare and human services. And all of us have a vested interest in increasing the returns on investment because returns on investment mean that children and their families are doing better. And there's nothing bad about that if it saves money, okay? If it's saving money for the right reasons, it means people are doing better, and that's good, and we want that to happen. And third, there are tremendous possibilities for scientists and people involved in practice and policy to get together, to talk about this stuff, to catalyze new thinking, come up with new strategies that will help us to increase economic opportunities, to increase social mobility in our country, which is getting to be more and more of a problem. We have decreasing mobility. We have increasing inequality. That is not going to turn around on itself. And what it means is we start with the best of what we have now, and we figure out where to go next. And it doesn't take away from the very important work in system building and the very important work in organizing unified data systems and the very important work on quality improvement, all of which is necessary, but it leaves unanswered the question of what are we going to do next, and some part of the field has to be thinking about that. So let me tell you about these two. Okay, so here's one of them. So this is the The last thing I want to say is this notion of how to create an environment that fosters innovation. I will tell you, as a person who spent my whole life in medicine and in academia, is I have had no experience with the world of innovation. That may sound strange, okay? But let's face it. I mean, sure, there are all kinds of new things being discovered in the healthcare world, but it's not a world that promotes innovation like Silicon Valley promotes innovation, or like the biotechnology world promotes innovation, because in those worlds, innovation means you're coming up with dozens of new ideas every day and trying new things all over the place, and you're failing left and right. All of the big breakthroughs come on the heels of multiple failures of things you've tried. And Thomas Edison, I think he still has the record for the most patents in this country. It's a wonderful quote. I've not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. We do not work in an environment that makes it safe to take risks. There was some discussion this morning about taking risks. We don't live in an environment that celebrates failure as an opportunity to learn. Because if we try new things, we don't try them because we think we're going to fail. We try them because we think they'll succeed. And then the question is, why didn't that work? Okay? That's how big breakthroughs come. People pile up. The people who make the last big breakthrough have the longest list of failures. We must create, I'm not going to change any of these fields entirely overnight. We have to create pockets of innovation in your world, in the early childhood world, where it's safe to try things, safe to fail. The mantra in that world is fail fast. If you're going to fail, don't take years to fail. Fail fast, learn something, and move on to do something different. The slide that's missing is an Albert Einstein quote. I think many of you know the famous Einstein quote of the true sign of insanity is to do the same experiment over and over again and expect a different result. I found an even better quote from Einstein, so I'm going to end with this quote. This is our website for those of you who want more materials. We have lots of materials there with a lot of complicated science, understandable for non-scientists. Not watered down, not dummied down, just understandable. Einstein said, if you always do what you always did, you will always get what you always got. So for me, that's the mantra for the world we live in. Let's take the best of what we do. Let's be proud of the best that we do, but let's be constructively dissatisfied and use a rapidly growing science to inform fresh thinking and new ideas and make a much bigger dent on this intergenerational cycle of poverty, which has to be slowed down. So I will stop here. I think we have more time, a little bit of time for questions and comments, so thank you very much.
Hear me? Oh,
That's
there
good.
you are.
Yep.
I was trying to figure out which question to ask you to be fair to everyone because I had so many. So I'm going to try to ask you this question and make it as short as possible. When you were talking about the stresses for the young people, I thought about an incident that I had this weekend when I went out to purchase some doors. And because my son has multiple diagnoses, and I couldn't understand why he had so many diagnoses when I never took any drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, or anything. So it was very confusing for me. And I advocate throughout the state of Maryland and the city of Baltimore, and I work with children with special needs, and I see all types of things. So these doors were built with formaldehyde in it, and I couldn't understand why are we selling inside doors with formaldehyde in it that is known to have carcinogenic effects and cause respiratory problems. But we have the same issues with food and medication and all of these things. This causes stresses for our children, for our parents. But if I threatened this guy with all types of things because I know all types of people. So he said, oh, well, let me look. And he decided that he could sell me a door, the same door without this formaldehyde, for more money. So parents of low income are stuck if they don't know about these types of things to get the lower price items. And then they feel guilty later, thinking they did these things to their children without knowing about it, if they find out about the information later. So they have these adverse stresses added on to them, if only I knew. So these are types of things, they are targeted, just like they were targeted with the cigarettes, just like they're targeted with so many other things. So those are some other stresses that you could add on to your slide, because they're targeted with the foods, they're targeted with these types of products, and it's so unfair. And our kids are suffering for that, and then their parents later suffer, and grandparents are suffering for that, for lack of knowledge of things that they didn't know beforehand.
I really appreciate that comment and question. And I have so many things I want to say in response, so like you, I will just pick a few. First, you really helped identify something that I didn't give enough attention to, which is I was emphasizing the extent to which experience interacts with genetics and affects outcomes, and didn't mean to understate at the same time the fact that particularly for children who have multiple problems, they're often, this is not an issue of necessarily anything a parent has done, but there may be problems constitutionally that contribute to these problems. So we shouldn't attribute everything to adverse experiences. It's an interaction. The other point about this is that whereas experiences, and again, I focused on experiences and the extent to which adults buffer children from adversity, but you put your finger on something very important, is that there are other influences on brain development and other organs, which are, and if influences from the physical environment, chemicals, things that are in the food supply, things that are in the water supply. Now, again, I don't want to create a sense of hysteria about this, but it's amazing how little has been studied of all of the things that are out there. So there are thousands and thousands and thousands of chemicals in the environment that we don't know anything about. But there are some that we do know something about. And you mentioned one. I think the real poster child right now is mercury, okay? I mean, we've known, at least everybody understands, and we have laws that recognize that lead can be damaging to the brain and to the kidneys and other organs. We know that mercury is a very serious neurotoxin, and we have mercury in parts of the food supply that is a huge risk factor for many children. So your point is a really important one, and the only point that I want to make about this in response is that once we start going down the road of cataloging everything, we'll all go crazy, right? We'll like lock ourselves in a room, and we won't go anywhere, and we'll be afraid to eat and afraid to go anywhere. So this is back to this issue of some balance between doing something about the things that we know are harmful, recognizing that there's a huge cost to be paid for not protecting all of our children. So for me, there's a huge moral responsibility here, and there's obviously a huge economic cost to the country. So I really appreciate your highlighting this. It is a problem.
You're so right, but they knew it was harmful. It was documented. I rushed right home, and I already knew that, but I rushed right home and looked it up at how long did they know that lead was harmful indoors. And it was early 1900s that they knew it, and they were still doing it, and I'm wondering why. Right. You know, that formaldehyde was still being put indoors that you put inside a home, but it's been targeted for poor people. Why is that? Why do you constantly want to target? You know, it makes me think about the lead, and that's what when I sent the email out, it made me think about lead poisoning. It made me think about the eradication of certain groups and stuff. It's so unfair. It's not right.
Thank you for your question and your point. It's a really important one. I can't see out there, so if anybody's there, just. Oh, okay.
Yes, we have a question from the live stream, and I think we're actually probably getting close to the end of our time, although I think we all agree we could probably talk about this for hours. But one of our, Ruthie, who's in Massachusetts, has asked if you could make 2 to 3 suggestions to state TANF administrators based on the brain development and executive functioning science, what would they be, and what new policies or practices would you like to see states test?
Thank you, Ruthie, wherever you are, for that question. Well, you know, I think what I would say now, I would guess just about all of you would say right now. So I think from even before welfare reform in the mid-90s, and certainly since, when we've been shining a bright light on that part of the population that is poor and having tremendous difficulty in securing income to support a family. For whatever reason people might have for either wanting to support or not support low-income women, and there's a huge range of ideological perspectives on that, and we work very hard to not get involved in partisan politics. The one thing that everybody obviously needs to understand, and does understand, people might not want to confront it, is that a child living in a family that is TANF eligible is a child who is at risk developmentally and health-wise. Okay? And so my first recommendation for TANF administrators, people who are responsible for this program, is to put the children of women on TANF right in the middle of the screen and ask the question of what could we do to reduce the burdens of adversity on these children in order to increase the likelihood that they will not grow up to be people who are eligible for TANF. Okay? Now, for me, that is a huge moral responsibility. I think for others, it could be a huge cost-benefit issue, but obviously the savings are long down the road after people are out of office. Okay? So this is a legacy issue. It's not a re-election issue. But what I think is most apparent, and what this science is saying, is that we can no longer have the children of women who are on TANF at the edge of the radar screen, no less off the radar screen. And thinking about the children's needs only in terms of how we could provide the least expensive child care while women are working or involved in other programs is actually, it doesn't make any sense, because these children, by all of what we've talked about today, are the most at risk for problems, and they are in a period of optimal plasticity to build strong foundations in brain architecture and their cardiovascular system and their immune system. And it's mind-boggling from a science point of view. I understand from a political point of view how people don't want to go there. But from a science point of view, it's like, what's wrong with this picture? It's like, here's a group of children, we know who they are, we know where they live, we know their names, we know their addresses. These should be one of the highest targeted groups for preventive intervention, focused on the children, which, by the way, is most effectively done by building the capacities of their mothers to be able to provide a better, well-regulated home environment to get the kids into good early childhood programs. At the same time, you're building the capacity to get a better job. So the simple answer to this question is put the kids in the middle of the screen. It makes no sense to only be thinking about them as a kind of a child care at the least expense consideration. Makes no sense at all. Sure.
When you were talking about toxic stress, I think that I may have heard you use the PTSD. Was that correct? So you actually do research on toxic stress to the point that it can be classified as PTSD.
So I personally don't do research in this area. I'm a pediatrician, and I kind of use the research of scientists to kind of address these issues. So let me answer it in this way. There's a growing evidence base now to indicate that you can now start to see in neuroimaging, MRIs and fMRIs and brain scans, areas of the brain that have been affected in individuals who have the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's really clear that there's a difference in susceptibility to post-traumatic stress disorder. Not everybody in a stressful environment ends up with a sense. So for children, we talk about the need for protection. For adults, actually, some of the work that's been done in soldiers that get PTSD is that there may be an underlying vulnerability that has its origins early in childhood in terms of those who are in the same situation, and some get PTSD and some don't. PTSD is a diagnosis. It's a clinical condition. Toxic stress is a physiological response. So toxic stress is not a diagnosis. It's not a disease. It's a physiological state that puts you at risk for problems. But clearly, I think as the science matures, we're going to learn more and more about the relationship between those two. And I probably should end with this point so that I don't kind of overcorrect in either direction. If you're ever given a multiple choice test And the question is, so is this genetic? Is this something you were born with, or is this the result of experience? The correct answer always is both contribute. I mean, people are born differently. Everybody is born with a different genetic constitution. Some people are more or less likely to end up in different circumstances, but environment has an influence. Think of the cancer issue, and this would be the last point. We know there are certain cancers that run in families, but not everybody in the family gets that cancer. And we know there are certain communities that have very high rates of particular cancers, but not everybody who lives in that community gets the cancer. Okay. Everything is about gene-environment interaction. If you live in an environment that is kind of well-supported, economically stable, and a reasonably healthy and safe place to live, and you go into a school and look at the differences in performance, it's mostly genetics that explains differences because everybody's in a pretty good environment. If you go into a community where the environment is filled with adversity, and you go into the schools, the differences are almost entirely explained by adverse experiences and how children have been protected by that. Genetics gets overwhelmed by environmental influences when you're dealing with significant levels of stress.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shanka, for that really thought-provoking presentation. That was great. So I just have a quick announcement before we move on to the rest of the day. It's around 3 o'clock right now. Our next set of breakout sessions starts at 3:45. So right now, between 3 o'clock and 3:45, we have a poster session. And this poster session is featuring work by what we call emerging scholars. These are folks who are in graduate school or early in their careers, and they're doing work related to anti-poverty programs and policies, doing research in those areas. So the posters are all around the back walls of the ballroom. You'll see them if you turn around. And they'll be, the scholars will be standing next to the posters to tell you about their work and answer any questions you may have. So we encourage you to take a break, get a tea, walk around and look at the posters, and we'll see you in the breakout sessions at 3:45. Thanks.